That night, Jo was sorting beans at the kitchen table, as her grandmother had taught her. The porch light flickered in the rain, and the small radio on the corner of the sink played a local station softly. She had lived alone since she finished college and moved back to Willow Street, that quiet street where everyone still greeted each other in the morning. She worked part-time at the local library and packed lunches on the weekends to supplement her income. It was a simple life, but it was hers, and she enjoyed the orderly silence of the routine. With the neighbors gone to bed and the streetlights half dimmed, the last thing she expected was someone knocking on her door. There were 3 quick, sharp knocks. When he opened it, Jo stepped back in surprise. A boy no more than 10 years old was standing there, soaking wet, with a tear in his shirt and wide eyes. There was a small cut near his eyebrow and dirt on his hands. He looked more scared than hurt, but it was hard to tell. "Please don't make me go back," he said, his voice almost drowned out by the drops dripping from his sodden cap. Jo didn't ask him anything. He just opened the door wider and motioned for him to come in. As he reached for a towel in the closet, he thought that whatever had happened, no one that age should be out like that at this time. Jo grabbed an old t-shirt she wore to bed, a loose sweatshirt, and a pair of sweatpants with a loose elastic waistband. She handed them to the boy and pointed. "To the bathroom. You can change. I'll leave the door ajar if you want. You don't have to close it all," she said, trying to keep her voice firm but gentle. He nodded, barely looking at her face. While he changed, Jo turned on the stove and heated up one of the rice, beans, and ground beef containers she was saving for the next day. She also put some water on to boil, chamomile tea, which was all she had besides strong coffee. When the boy came back, his dry clothes hanging off his too small body, she pulled out one of the chairs and made him sit at the table. He didn't speak, just stared at his plate, as if it was something he wasn't sure he could touch. Jo put the fork in his hand without saying anything. It took a few seconds, but he started eating, hungry, but still slowly, as if he was trying to hide how much he needed it. Jo watched his eyes between bites. His eyes were sunken, as if he'd seen more than he should have, as if he carried a guilt that wasn't even his. She wanted to ask him where he'd come from, why he was alone, who had hurt him, but she didn't. Instead, she just said, "There's more, if you want it." And for a second, she saw what looked like a half smile, tight, shy, barely noticeable, but enough to tell her that, at least for now, he was a little less afraid. After he ate, he sat there, hugging his oversized sweatshirt, his still dirty feet dangling without touching the floor. Jo brought a basin of warm water and a clean towel. She knelt down and cleaned his feet carefully without saying a word. She noticed marks on his shins, scratches, old bruises. He flinched a little when she moved the towel closer to his groin, and that was enough for her to understand that there was something more serious behind his escape. It wasn't just a stumble on the street or a silly fight at home. There was pain there that didn't just come from the skin. When she finished cleaning, she pulled the blanket off the couch, spread it on the guest mattress, and told him he could sleep there. "I'll be here in the kitchen for a while, but if you need me, just call." He didn't answer, but lay down and pulled the blanket up to his nose. Jo turned off the main lights and left only the lamp on. She sat back in the kitchen, her mug of tea cooling in her hand, and stared at the rain beating down on the window. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. His presence was a cry for help, but it was also a responsibility the world might not understand. Still, she felt a quiet certainty that she had done the right thing. She didn't know the boy's name or what had happened to him, but right now she didn't need to know. She just needed to make sure that, for one night at least, he was safe. Jo spent the night awake, not because she was alert or afraid, but because her body seemed to understand that the boy needed more than a bed and a warm plate. He needed someone there. She swept the kitchen twice, rearranged the cupboard, and washed the stove. Unnecessarily, everything in silence, respecting the visitor's light sleep. Between one task and another, she would return to the bedroom door and listen. Around 3 in the morning, she heard a suppressed cry. Not a loud or desperate cry, it was more like a choked sob from someone who has learned that there is no point in screaming. Joe came in slowly and sat on the floor next to the mattress. She didn't touch him. She just stayed there, letting him know that there was someone with him. Minutes passed until he opened his eyes and, without saying a word, reached out his hand. She held it firmly and without pity. They stayed like that for almost half an hour. When he fell asleep again, she got up and went to get a pillow for herself. She slept, leaning against the wall, sitting up with her head tilted to the side. It wasn't comfortable, but at that moment nothing mattered more than being that support for someone who clearly never had one. In the morning, she woke up to the sound of the wind blowing on the clothesline. The boy was still sleeping, breathing more deeply, as if his body had finally understood that it could rest. Joe got up with his back stiff and his heart heavy. He knew that the next day would be difficult, that he would have to deal with delicate decisions, but he also knew that if he didn't do anything, he would carry that omission for the rest of his life. He had already seen too much to pretend he didn't see it. Around 8 a.m., Joe called the County Social Services Center. He asked to speak to someone experienced in abuse cases and made it clear that he didn't want a police car with sirens or a police officer coming through the door. "If you're going to scare the child, don't come," he said firmly. On the other end of the line, the operator hesitated, but assured her that they would send a trained assistant by the end of the morning. Joe thanked her and hung up. Then he went to make breakfast. Buttered toast, sliced bananas, and chocolate milk. Everything was simple, but made with intention. When the boy woke up and came into the kitchen, his eyes were puffy and his shoulders hunched. Joe pulled out his chair casually and said, "Sit down, it's warm." He obeyed silently, but this time he looked directly at her for a second longer. It was in that look that she realized something important. He wanted to trust her, he just didn't know if he could. Between bites, he let out a short sentence like someone testing the temperature of water before diving in. "Are you going to give me back?" Joe felt a knot in his stomach, not because he didn't have a ready answer, but because he understood that the question wasn't about her. It was about all the adults who had come before. "I'm going to do what's best for you, and staying here in silence isn't enough. I need to call someone who can really help you." He stayed silent. He didn't cry. He didn't question. He just bit into his toast and looked out the window. It was the first morning in a long time that he was here, alive with food on his plate and someone who didn't treat him like a nuisance. And that, in that moment, was almost miraculous. The social worker arrived shortly after 10, driving a discreet, unmarked car as Joe had requested. She was a middle-aged woman, her hair tied in a practical bun and a clipboard clutched to her chest. Before going in, Joe greeted her on the porch and spoke softly, looking her in the eye. "His name is Nathan. He didn't say much, but what he said is enough. He's hurt, inside and out. If you don't come calmly, he'll close it again." The woman, named Denise, nodded respectfully. Joe led her into the kitchen, where Nathan was still sitting at the table, pushing his banana around his plate with his fork. When he saw the stranger, he stiffened. Joe noticed the immediate movement. His shoulders rose, his jaw dropped a little, and his eyes searched for an exit. It was instinctive, automatic. Denise didn't approach him right away. She took off her coat, pulled up a chair, and sat down at a safe but visible distance. She opened her purse and took out a piece of paper and some colored pencils. "I just wanted you to help me with a drawing. Is that okay?" she asked, without changing her tone of voice. Nathan didn't answer, but he watched. Joe remained in the kitchen, washing dishes with his back turned, pretending not to pay attention. But her every gesture was measured, ready to intervene if something got out of control. After a few minutes of silence, Nathan slowly got up, pulled the paper towards him, and began to draw. It was a house with a large door. In the corner, a small, huddled figure. Denise didn't say anything. She just wrote something quickly on the card and looked at Joe. At that moment, they both knew that even without words, that boy had told the essential. Now, they had to act delicately, without breaking what little he was beginning to rebuild. Joe offered Denise coffee and some more chocolate milk to Nathan, who didn't even look at her, but accepted it. The tension in the air was thick, but there was something else there too, a kind of layered care. Denise explained that she couldn't promise that he would stay there, but she assured him that she would be heard before making any hasty decisions. Joe nodded, drying his hands on the dish towel. "I don't want to adopt anyone, and I'm not trying to be a hero. I just don't want him to be pushed back to where he came from." Denise understood. It wasn't a gesture of charity nor paternalism. It was something else, humanity. The process would be long. Denise needed to activate the system, find a safe place, someone with a suitable profile. But she assured him that, at least for that night, Nathan could stay there. Joe felt a dry relief. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start. As soon as Denise left, Joe looked at Nathan and said simply, "Tonight you sleep here again. That's all that matters." He didn't answer, but this time he didn't look away. Later, as she was mending the hem of a towel in the living room, she heard footsteps approaching. Nathan sat on the floor next to her chair, in silence. They stayed there side by side, listening to the ticking of the wall clock and the sound of the needle piercing the fabric. It wasn't conversation, it was companionship. Joe knew he still carried a lot of fear, distrust, guilt, but at that moment, sitting next to her, was already an immense gesture of trust. Small to someone from the outside looking in, but huge to someone who had spent her life running away. And Joe was willing to embrace that, one step at a time, even if it meant sleepless nights and a routine turned upside down. The next morning, Joe woke up before the sun, as usual. Not because she needed to, but because the habit of getting up early had already stuck to her, like the smell of coffee on a dishcloth. She made cornmeal porridge with cinnamon, something she hadn't done in years, and left a covered bowl on the stove. The silence in the house was different. Before, it had been a silence full of space. Now it was a silence that observed, that listened to someone else's footsteps. Nathan took a while to come out of the room. When he did, still wearing a thin t-shirt and borrowed pants, his eyes were puffy. Joe didn't ask anything. He just pointed to the table. He sat down slowly, as if testing the floor. He ate in silence, but this time he cleaned his plate. After that, she spent some time walking around the porch, looking at the floor, sometimes at the sky. Joe noticed that he seemed to be counting the boards with his feet, as if he wanted to remember that place. She didn't interrupt. She just swept the yard and pretended not to notice. The social worker called later, saying that the referral was almost ready. There was a safe shelter a few miles away. It had a good reputation, but it would only be a bridge to something more definitive. Joe listened attentively and then sat down at the table to tell Nathan, as simply as he could, "You're going to be staying somewhere else for a while. People I trust, but I'll know where you are, and if you want to write to me, I'll write back." He didn't cry. He just bit his lip and stared at the floor. Joe, with the calm of someone who has held many other people's pains, stretched out his hand across the table. "But before you go, there's one thing." He got up, went to his room, and came back with a piece of paper folded in three. It was the paper Joe had been writing on since the night before, in a firm, slow, unhurried hand. At the top, his name, right in the center, as if it were the title of a book. Below, a few lines. "You are seen, you are safe, you are someone." He folded it carefully, as if wrapping a souvenir, and placed it in his hands. Nathan held it as if it were glass. He looked at it for a few seconds, not really understanding what he was feeling, but feeling everything at the same time. He said nothing. He just put the paper in his pants pocket with an almost sacred care. Joe noticed that his hands were still shaking, but not as much as before. When Denise's car arrived, Joe walked with it to the gate. It was cloudy. Nathan got into the back seat without resistance, but before the door closed, he looked at Joe as if asking for something he couldn't say. She understood. She leaned over, adjusted the collar of his shirt, and said softly, "You can come back whenever you want. There's no lock here." He nodded and walked away. The street was emptier than before. Joe walked home slowly, feeling the still midday air. He sat down on the porch chair, the same one he always had, and took a deep breath. From the outside, everything looked the same, but inside there was a room that was no longer just for guests, an extra bowl in the cupboard, a name that was now part of his day. Joe knew he might never see it again, but he also knew that what had been planted therein, that house did not depend on return. It was already alive, and she believed, because she had seen it with her own eyes, that it was enough to change the course of a life. The following days passed slowly. Joe continued with his routine. He cleaned the house in the morning, tended to the plants, went to the market at the same times, talked to the neighbors in the same calm and present tone as always. But there was a small difference, almost invisible, in the way he closed the door when he left. It was no longer with that light, careless push, but with a more attentive movement, as if he was still wondering if anyone inside would need him again. At night, he turned on the lamp in the hallway again, a habit he had stopped after the children moved out. He continued to leave an extra blanket folded on the couch and the cookie jar more visible in the kitchen. These were details, but they said a lot. And little by little, even without direct news, Joe began to feel that Nathan was somehow okay. She heard discreet reports from Denise that he was in a house with other boys, that he ate well, that he liked to help in the kitchen, that he was quieter than he spoke, but that he no longer trembled as much when he heard footsteps behind him. Joe listened attentively, but didn't ask too many questions. He knew that some things take time to blossom and others need space to take root. She continued to sit on the porch in the afternoons, sometimes reading, sometimes just looking at the street. Some neighbors who had been distant before now came closer, not to talk about Nathan. Few really knew what had happened, but to ask how she was, if she needed anything. It was as if what Joe had done had spread silently, and people responded in the only way they knew how, by offering small kindnesses. She accepted each one with gratitude, but she couldn't help but think about how a boy who barely spoke had left such a deep mark. 2 months later, the first envelope arrived. No clear return address, just the name Joe handwritten in the corner. Inside was a carefully folded piece of paper with lines that were a mix of childish handwriting and adult attempt. "Hi, I'm fine. I made some cornbread that burned on the bottom but was good on top. Denise said I'm moving to a new house soon, smaller, with fewer boys. She said it's good, but I just wanted to let you know. I didn't throw your note away. It stays under my pillow. Sometimes I read it again before I go to sleep. I guess that's it. Oh, and thank you for the gumbo and the silence. I've never eaten anything so good or had such peace." Joe read the letter twice without rushing. Then he folded it again and put it inside his Bible between 2 pages that spoke of comfort. He didn't write back right away. I thought he needed to know that he could write without the obligation of expecting anything in return. But a week later, he sent a short reply, written in the same firm handwriting as before. "Everything is the same here. The tomato plant has finally blossomed. I miss someone to taste the beans. Whenever you want to write, I'm here, always." He didn't use "with love" or "sincerely." He just signed it Joe, as if they were the same. And in a way, they were, because they both knew what it was like to spend nights in silence, waiting for some kind of reassurance that never came. And both of them, in different ways, had learned to offer this to each other. The exchange didn't have to be daily or constant, but it was real, and from that moment on, the letters became a habit without rules. Sometimes they were short, sometimes just with a drawing or a poorly copied recipe. But they came, and that was enough. It was a February morning, colder than usual for that region, when Joe received a different kind of call. It wasn't from Denise, who rarely called, preferring to pass on information by letter or in occasional visits. It was a social worker Joe had never heard of. The woman was direct, but with a respectful tone. Nathan is being transferred to a foster home in another city. The process was expedited because of internal issues, but he insisted that we call you. He said he couldn't leave without you knowing. Joe was silent for a few seconds. It wasn't the kind of news he was expecting that morning as he took bread out of the oven and prepared to sweep the porch. He thanked her, politely hung up, and stood there holding the dishcloth, staring at the kettle on the stove as if waiting for some answer from it. He didn't cry, he didn't speak loudly, but he felt a familiar emptiness settling in his chest. The same feeling he had had when his husband left, when his children moved, when he realized that Sundays were now always silent. Nathan wasn't her grandson or her son, not officially, but there was something about that hasty goodbye that hurt more than she expected. It was like losing something she hadn't even known she could have. During the day, she kept busy the seat, way she always did, washing, cooking, pruning the plants, but at night, for the first time in a long time, she left the hallway light off. It was her way of accepting his absence, not as defeat, but as recognition. He was leaving. Maybe he wouldn't write again, maybe he would, but either way, he was out of her physical range. And now she had to learn how to continue to feel love for someone she could no longer touch. The following months passed slowly, but without any acute pain. It was a more mature kind of longing, one that doesn't stop life from going on. Joe continued with his activities, although there were days when he would stop for a few seconds in front of the closet, where there was still the mug that Nathan had used on the mornings he stayed there. He never used it. It was as if that small object had gained the status of a reliquary, more of a memory than a utensil. The letters began to become scarce. At first they came in intervals, then they stopped altogether. Joe wasn't surprised. He knew that teenagers go through phases and that sometimes emotional survival requires silence. She didn't demand it. She just kept the box where she kept the old ones under her bed, revisiting one or another on the days when her chest felt tighter. She didn't talk about Nathan with the neighbors, not out of shame or pain, but because that story was theirs and no one else's. It didn't need to become porch talk, but once a month she would make a complete gumbo, just the way he liked it. Even though she didn't know if he remembered the flavor, she served herself a smaller portion and left the rest frozen. In case he comes back one day, she would say softly, without anyone hearing. It was her way of keeping hope alive, but without making it a heavy expectation. Over time, she began to sleep better again. She began to hum in the kitchen again, to laugh alone at old TV shows, to exchange recipes with the neighbor across the street. Life went on, with the mark of Nathan's presence etched in every small gesture, but without that stopping what was to come. Because Joe knew that the love that's worth it isn't the one that demands return. It's the one that stays, even in silence. On this particular day, years later, Joe wasn't expecting a visitor. The morning had started like so many others. She fed the neighbor's cats, who had come to visit a sick sister, brewed fresh coffee, and sat on the porch with the radio on low, listening to the local news. It was a warm, early spring day. The trees were already starting to bud, and the air carried that sweet scent that heralds the change of season. It was only by chance that she heard a car engine slowing down. She didn't turn it on right away. The street was quiet, but sometimes the mail carriers stopped there, or a delivery man got the house numbers mixed up. But this time, the sound of the engine stopping was followed by a thick silence, and the sound of determined footsteps on the gravel. Joe looked up and saw a man standing in front of the gate. He was taller than she remembered, stronger with broad shoulders, a well-cut dark suit, and his eyes were the same. For a moment, She didn't know what to do, nor did he. They stood there, looking at each other for an incalculable amount of time. He was the one who broke the silence. "It took me a while, but I'm back." His voice still had that hoarseness it had when he was a child, but now it was firmer. Joe opened the gate without saying anything and pulled him into a hug, the kind that doesn't require words. For a moment, time stopped being real. There was no calendar, no distance, no formality that could be imposed. It was just the reunion of two pieces that had never stopped belonging to each other, even when they were apart. When they sat down, she was the one who broke the ice, half laughing, "Would you like gumbo?" And he, with a look of a child and an adult at the same time, replied, "Only if it's yours." The conversation at that lunch wasn't full of big revelations or punchlines. It was simple. Nathan told her that he had studied, that he had faced difficult times, that he had almost given up more than once. He said he had never forgotten the night he knocked on that door, that the note, the one she had written in blue pen and rounded handwriting, was still with him. He said he kept it in his wallet, but in fact he had memorized it. "You are seen. You are safe. You are someone." She repeated it as if it were a prayer. Joe listened attentively without interrupting. Sometimes he smiled, other times he pressed his lips together, but her eyes never left his, not for a second. When he told her that he had passed the federal judge exam, she almost dropped her spoon. "Judge?" she asked, more in surprise than incredulity, and he nodded, saying that he wanted to be the kind of man who would protect other children like him. He also said that he would mention her name at the inauguration, if she would let him. Because this is where it all started. Joe took his hand across the table. He didn't say yes or no, but the way she held it firmly and kept her eyes fixed on his was answer enough. That kitchen, with its smell of spices and the sound of pots bubbling, seemed more solemn than any courtroom. There, in that silent exchange of pride and affection, was true justice. Nathan stayed there for the rest of the day. He helped wash the dishes, walked her to the grocery store, chatted with neighbors who barely remembered him. By nightfall, he had made up his mind. He didn't want to leave. "Now it's my turn to take care of you." And Joe, for the first time in a long time, felt that his home was complete. The next morning, Joe woke up earlier than usual, even though he hadn't slept well. Anxiety had kept him tossing and turning for most of the night, but it wasn't the bad kind. It was like when you're expecting a loved one to visit, or when you hear in your chest that echo of something good about to happen. The house, now with more footsteps in the hallway, seemed more alive. Nathan had slept in the old guest room, the one with the patchwork blanket and the flowered curtains that she'd never had the courage to change. He came out of the room already dressed, his shirt starched and hissed shoes, a nice contrast to the weather-beaten wooden table and the coffee pot sizzling on the stove. "Today's the day," he said, taking a slice of bread and spreading butter on it as if he'd always done. "That there?" Joe nodded, putting some fruit in a bowl for him. It wasn't the kind of occasion that called for too many words. They both knew what this moment meant. The black car that would take him to the ceremony arrived before 9. It was official, elegant, but discreet. Nathan looked at Joe before leaving. She adjusted his tie with careful, story-filled hands and said, "Stand up straight, but don't lose that heart." He smiled, moved. He reached for the inside pocket of his jacket, where the note was still folded. "It's here," he said. Joe didn't go with him. He declined the invitation to go to the inauguration. "I don't need to see it. I just need to know." She preferred to listen later, calmly, sitting in her usual chair. He understood. When he got in the car and drove away, she stood there on the porch, waving. Her eyes were wet, but her chest was full. Nathan was already a judge, but to her, he had always been much more than that. He was the boy who came back. The ceremony, as expected, was formal, with technical speeches and guests in ties. But when it was time for Nathan to speak, the mood changed. At first, everyone expected more of the same. formal thanks, some quote about justice, and perhaps a comment about the future. But he began differently. He said that this day was not about him, but about the woman who years ago on a rainy night opened the door and offered shelter to a boy she didn't know. The room fell silent immediately. No one had expected that story, and yet every word held their attention. He told of the bruised knee, the bowl of hot soup, the heavy, safe blanket, the way she didn't ask questions, just offered care. He told of the note, the way she treated his pain not with pity, but with respect. The first person who saw me as a whole was wearing slippers and an apron, he said. And then with a firm voice he added, if I ever deserve this position, it will be because I was built with her hands. There were discreet tears. The audience, accustomed to cold ceremonies, was overcome with silence. He did not use her full name. He called her simply Jo. But for those who knew her, nothing more was needed. The story spread quickly. That same day, journalists sought her out. But Jo, back at home, refused to give interviews. Let him shine, was all he said. That night, when he turned on the television and saw his little boy dressed in a suit, moving everyone, he just smiled. The bowl of gumbo sat cooling beside him, untouched, not for lack of appetite, but because his heart was too full for anything else. And 2 days later, before the sun had even fully warmed the sidewalks of Willow Street, a plain white car pulled up in front of Joe's house. It wasn't the vehicle from the ceremony, and there were no photographers around. It was just Nathan, still in a suit, but with his jacket thrown over the passenger seat and his tie already a little loose around his neck. He got out with calm steps, as if he were returning to a place where he had always belonged. Joe was in the backyard, tending to his little pots of basil and lavender, the same ones he insisted on keeping even when the heat was too much or his back hurt. When she saw him, she stopped. Not out of surprise. She had known he would come, but because she hadn't expected to see him so soon. Nathan didn't say anything right away. He just hugged her, long, firm, like someone holding time in his arms. When he finally pulled away a little, he simply said, I didn't come to visit, I came to stay. Now it's my turn to take care of you. She smiled in the way that only Joe could smile, with her eyes first. It took a while, my son. They sat right there on the old bench in the garden, the sun shining through the leaves and casting shadows on the ground. Joe offered him a lemonade, and he accepted. It was as if the years had melted away in that moment. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything they had said without words. And as they drank slowly, Nathan placed a brown envelope on her lap. These are the papers, he explained. I want you to be my mother, in name, in law, in everything. Joe didn't open the envelope right away. He just held it between his fingers with the firmness of someone who understands the weight and lightness of such a gesture. Joe didn't answer right away. He stared at the envelope as if he could see all the paths that had led Nathan to that moment. She knew what it meant. It wasn't just a legal request or a symbolic gesture. It was confirmation of something that had been true for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but without hesitation. I always have been, ever since you knocked on that door. Nathan nodded, moved. They didn't need a ceremony or witnesses. That officialization was just a way of sealing what was already engraved between them, like those marks that time leaves on the wood of a table or on the palm of the hand of someone who lives. A long time. In the following days, Nathan began to organize his things in the house. He remodeled the back room, changed the lock on the door that kept getting stuck, and brought in a new radio to replace the old one, which only played one station. It wasn't a radical change, it was a return. Each gesture was thought out, not as someone who wants to occupy a space, but as someone who takes care of the place where an important part of him was born. Jo, on the other hand, allowed herself to rest a little more. She sat on the porch more often, asked him to help her take down the boxes from the upper cabinet, and sometimes let him cook dinner. The first time Nathan tried to make the gumbo, he got the seasoning wrong, but she ate it anyway, without correcting it. "It's almost there," she said with a gentle smile. He got the message. It wasn't about getting the seasoning right. It was about keeping the memory of caring alive. And he already knew how to do that. The first time Joe went to the courtroom to see Nathan in action, she wore her best dress, the navy blue, heavy cotton one she saved for occasions when she wanted to feel truly present. The room was large, filled with serious people, and Joe sat discreetly in the back row where she could see without being seen. She watched as he conducted the proceedings with firmness and kindness, calling each person by name, listening with real attention, treating everyone with the same respect, whether they were a renowned lawyer or a frightened defendant. She didn't understand all the legal terms, but she understood every gesture, every pause he made before speaking, every time he looked directly at someone, as if to say, "You're here, and I see you." When the proceedings ended, she didn't go to him. She knew there was a rush, commitments, protocol. She walked home alone, walking slowly, but with tears in her eyes. Not with pride, but with recognition. He was the same boy she had once taken in, soaking wet, with scraped knees and frightened eyes. Now he was there, standing firm, taking care of justice for an entire country with the same delicacy with which she had once offered him a bowl of hot soup. That night, she took the old note out of the tea box where she kept her mementos. The handwriting was his. "You gave me a name worth answering to." She read it again as if for the first time. Then she put it away with another paper, the official adoption paper, 2 names side by side. And for a long moment, Joe felt that none of it had been a coincidence. It had been a choice. Hers, his, life's, choices made in silence, sustained by the courage to love without guarantees. Years later, on a quiet Sunday morning, with the smell of coffee mingling with the smell of wet earth, Nathan was organizing the small bookshelf in the living room when he found, among the cookbooks and old magazines, a thick-covered notebook. It was Joe's notebook, where she wrote recipes but also random sentences, notes to herself, and thoughts she never said out loud. He leafed through it carefully, as if touching a reliquary. On one of the middle pages, almost hidden among notes on how to preserve mint in the summer, was written, "It doesn't matter where someone comes from. What matters is what we do when someone knocks on our door." Nathan closed the notebook with a tightness in his chest. That was her. Simple, direct, with the wisdom of people who have lived long enough to understand that life is built between the lines. That same day, he took the notebook to the community library and asked them to digitize excerpts for a social project he was starting, aimed at-risk youth, offering legal and emotional support. He named the project Open Door in her honor. When asked why he gave it that name, he simply said, "Because justice begins before the law. It begins with someone saying, 'Come in, you're safe here.'" And it was true. Joe never sought recognition. He never sought fame or medals. But in the end, it was his quiet courage, his unwavering kindness, and his unconditional care that changed not only Nathan's life, but the lives of countless others who may never know his name. Yet all of them, in some way, would live under the shelter of his open door.